I'm going to start out with some personal stories because this particular topic concerns what the work I'm doing right now in Arizona. I'm the headmaster now since this last September of a new Orthodox school, K-12, the Three Hierarchs Academy, just down the street from the Monastery of St. Anthony's in Florence, Arizona. And I cannot stress enough, both from my experience but also from everything I've seen over the last 18 years in Greece, that the Orthodox school, especially for the youngest children, is one of the most important bastions and fortresses of the church going forward. It's going to be, for us, an essential element of the life of the church if we're going to survive the onslaught of secularism. I like to say in America, I don't know if you're familiar here in Australia, you've heard of the Alamo and the battle back in the 19th century, and there's an expression there that the Alamo was the last stand. And for us, the schools are our Alamo. It's our last stand against the onslaught of secularism. We are losing generations of Orthodox Christians because the educational systems in the Western world are not only not helping our children, they're designed to take our children away from us. And you have to understand this. You have to understand the history of compulsory state education for the last 200 years. I gave a lecture, it's online, if anyone wants to go more deeper into this. Compulsory state education began in the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century in Germany, contemporary Germany, and its aim was not for the formation in Christ or even the formation per se of the children, but the socialization and in particular the service of the next generation to the formation of a modern state. And the aim of education in the beginning had nothing to do with the classical vision of Socrates or of the trivium, the grammar stage or the logic stage or the rhetoric stage, which is the classical educational approach. It had everything to do with creating a modern mechanized state and putting people at work for the sake of that state. And so the education was intentionally limited for the masses, and only for the elite did they have a higher education. Over time, throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, especially with the totalitarian regimes of Mussolini, Hitler, and Lenin, you see an explosion of state education precisely for the indoctrination of the people into the socialist and communist and fascist systems. They saw it as an opportunity, again, to form and shape the masses. It was not about formation in Christ, anything but, it was the opposite. And the growth of compulsory state education is directly associated with the growth of these anti-Christian regimes. And so not only did that happen politically for political reasons, but we have a shift in contemporary education, the vision of what it's meant to do. Classically, traditionally, among Christian peoples, we have the ideal, we have the archetype, who is Christ. We have the ideal, which is to take someone and initiate them into virtue, grow them in terms of the virtue, present to them, as St. John Chrysostom says, examples of virtue. That's the main aim of education. It's not knowledge in terms of gnosis, in terms of just acquiring academic or technical knowledge. That's not the aim of education. It's the formation in the virtues, in other words, to become gods by grace ultimately in the church. And we have now at the end of the 19th century, especially in America, we have an inversion, not just a departure, but an inversion, because there is no common denominator in multicultural and pluralistic societies because, especially in the 19th century in America, they wanted to enculturate and assimilate masses of immigrants. They wanted an educational system which would serve that purpose. And we're very naive if we think by sending our children to the state education, we're not undermining their life in Christ. That's very clear today, I think, to everyone with all of these, the latest in a long line of departures from the Christian anthropology and the Christian vision of formation, of morphosis. It's very obvious, I think, to everyone where this is going. But it's been going on not for 10 or 20 or 30, but hundreds of years. It's a vision of man directly as a fruit of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, of course, was the great leap and departure away from the classical vision, the Renaissance even earlier. So we have the fruits of the Enlightenment would have been the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the American Revolution. And in that context, education was also formed and shaped. John Dewey, who's a famous educator in the United States, was a part of this, very influential in what they understood to be the center of education. And of course, the center of education today is the child, and egotistically so. Not that the child is going to be formed in Christ, or formed in virtue, or formed in any kind of even ancient Greek or Latin ideal, but that we're going to allow the discovery of the child. We're going to leave him to his devices. It's the inversion of the Christian vision. So we could go on for a long time. You can see the lectures I've done online. There's 2 lectures that I gave a year ago, in April in California, talking about compulsory education and where it's leading and what it's all about and where it comes from. But also there's a lecture on post-patristic theology and the vision, which is very much a part of the contemporary theological scene, which is a diversion and a departure from patristic theology, and the classical or traditional understanding of Orthodox education. So I don't want to go further in that direction, but one has to understand the immediate need for us to start Orthodox schools everywhere. And I think what's very encouraging is that without a lot of cooperation, we see that happening all over the world. I'm very encouraged today. I went to the school today, had the blessing, and saw what is in the works, and I hope it happens very quickly, and I hope everyone understands the urgency for this school to open. It is a matter of salvation for our children. It is a matter of the continuation of the gospel in the future generations, but immediately we need this. We needed it yesterday in terms of protecting our children from delusion and from immorality and all the rest. So the need is immense. In Orthodox countries, the need is immense. In Greece, for 18 years, everyone has been saying we need to open up schools run by the church and not rely on state schools, which are becoming undermined and perverted by European liberalism and Marxism. And we have responded. God has blessed this opening of this school in Arizona that I've been appointed as headmaster. I want to talk a little bit about how that started, share a little personal experience to encourage you all to continue and to work hard on opening your school. Last March, a year ago, it was decided by faithful near the monastery, people who've moved from all over the United States to be close to the monastery in St. Anthony, after years of discussion, that we need to finally just leap out in faith without having everything organized, without having a lot of money, without having a lot of ideas of who's going to teach, and literally just leaping out in faith and saying, let's do this. And they began in March. They began making phone calls. They began talking to potential teachers. They had some people who were going to offer basically a home, which we transformed into a school, and very quickly developed whatever we could in terms of a curriculum and the books we chose, and things were thrown together in almost overnight. Within 4 or 5 months, the school opened in September, and they were expecting, because I was at that time still in Greece. I came actually after the opening of the school. That was the earliest I could come. I had gone back to Greece for 3 or 4 months. And they opened the school with initially they thought they would have 25 students. They opened with 52. And we had a good crisis on our hands. We didn't have places to put the kids. We had 8 or 9 kids in a room the size of an office with a desk and chairs. And this house was transformed into our school, and we've been operating in crisis mode all year, trying to catch up both in terms of the infrastructure, the economics, the curriculum, and all the rest. And so there comes a time, and I would say this to the folks who are planning the school, you just got to do it. You just got to say, we're not ready. We're never going to be ready. If you think there's going to be the day where it's all going to be organized and everything's going to be perfect, you're going to be waiting for decades. You just got to start. And when you start and you leap out in faith, the Lord blesses. And so we've been making it every month economically. We've had donors come out. We've had people write us and say we want to move there for the sake of the school. People from all over the United States and even from Greece. People who have supported us with checks and with donations from different parts of the United States. And we're moving forward step by step to create our own curriculum. And we have people writing us saying next year they're going to enroll. And so thanks be to God, we have a new second building that we've opened for the high school kids. We have 39 in K through 6 and 13 in the high school. And we've opened now, we've carved out in one of the 2 houses that we have now, we've carved out a chapel. So we are now serving Divine Liturgy when I'm there every week. And this is, of course, at the center of the school. The center of the school has to be the Divine Liturgy, the attending of the divine services, and the prayer of the children. So there's no blueprint for this. I've been amazed as I get to know educators from around the world and around the country, how they've been schools like St. John of Shanghai in San Francisco, or Padilla Elementary down in Florida, or other places around the country. They're opening up the last 5 or 10 years, and no one has an Orthodox curriculum. They're literally improvising year to year. So we're pathfinders to this Orthodox education in the English language for a variety of reasons. Because Orthodoxy is new in the English-speaking world, because Orthodox schools, for the most part, in traditional Orthodox countries, either were not operating for most of the 20th century and under the communist regimes, or they've been following Western models in those countries which were influenced by the Western mentality and the non-Orthodox mentality. So there's aspects of Orthodox theology, curriculum everywhere, but there's not a unified, thought-out Orthodox curriculum. And so we're having to embark on that, and we're working with people in different parts of the country. And I think we're going to be working together, I hope, with you and your educators as well. We need one another. We need to work together if we're going to make this happen. But I'm very encouraged by the amount of zeal and desire on people everywhere to see the schools operate, open, and teach our children. So it's only going to get better if we just are patient and we do the work and we make progress. So that's a few words of introduction. I'm happy to answer more practical or personal questions after the talk. I want to present you the next two sections, a little bit about the theory and then about the practice of what I think goes into an Orthodox school. And of course, as I said, this is a work in progress. So you might talk to me in a year's time and I might have amended this. But from what I can tell, from meeting and talking to other educators, this is what we have at the time for the time being. As I said, there's 2 schools of thought in terms of education. There's the public Western model that has essentially been developed since the Enlightenment, especially over the last 150 years, which is definitely not an expression of the Christian vision, and that is something that we don't want to follow and we reject. And there's the classical education, which was formed structurally from the time of the ancient Greeks and was consistent throughout all of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it was picked up in the West as well. So structurally, we have some similarities with classical education in the West, but in many other ways, the classical education movement, which is very much alive today in America, it's been a renaissance in the last 25 years. There's hundreds and hundreds of schools that have opened up by Roman Catholics and Protestants in rejection of the public vision, the state schools, and they're projecting a classical education. I'm going to talk a little about what that is and what we don't like about it. Because again, the Orthodox vision is unique. It's not just as they would say, some people would say, Orthodoxy is like Catholicism without the Pope. Well, this is not classical education without, a few things taken away. It's a different vision. But the closest thing to that vision right now in Western society is classical education, as it's been understood by many educators today. So we have to begin there. And again, structurally, it is also akin to what we've done in the past. So if you went back to the 14th or the 13th century, you wanted to see how St. Gregory Palamas was educated, for instance, or even back to the early fathers, you would see that the basic structure is the same. That structure is going to be, first of all, we need to say that it was all very, very intimate and like a family. It was never this mass education that we see today. It was, if you wanted to be highly educated in the 5th, 6th, 8th, 10th, 12th century in the Roman Empire, you would have a tutor. You would probably not begin education outside of your mother and father until you were 7, 8, or 9, or even 10 years old. The tutor would have come and been paid, probably to your house, or you would have gathered together with a few other people, a handful of people around that tutor. Maybe a little bit more if there was some particular state education for the purpose of serving the state. So we do see that in the Roman Empire. We see that there was a desire on the part of the state to have people who were well educated in law and in Latin and in Greek to be able to serve the purposes of the state. But there was a very small amount of people. Most people who were educated for the 1,000 years of the Romeocini, the Roman Empire, the Orthodox Empire, were educated by the church, and they weren't highly educated. They were educated in the basics. They passed through, if the stages they would have passed through following along the lines of the ancient Greek education would have been 3 stages: grammar, logic or dialectic, and rhetoric. Those are the classic stages that you see in both East and West, and even in after the Renaissance in the West. Let me say right off the bat, so what happened? Why do we have a divergence in terms of the vision of education in the East and the West, between the Orthodox and the West? Well, the Renaissance happened. And one of the reasons why we have a classical education renaissance in the 14th, 15th century is precisely to get away from classical Christian approaches. So its origins are not necessarily Christian, but they were still seeking to educate them in the basics of the grammar, dialectic or logic, and rhetoric. They were learning Latin and they were learning Greek, and this is what it meant to be an educated person in the West. But there was small groups. There were always small groups, and it was personal, and it was a tutor, and you were learning from that tutor everything. So that's one of the first things we're trying to replicate, is that we want to keep things small. We want to keep it a family atmosphere. We want to have their children hug their teachers, take the blessing of their priests, and form enduring, lifelong friendships. We want intimate relationships with their teachers. And this is how, as I said, education was characterized for most of history. Small groups of determined students gathered around their tutor, learning from him not only a narrow corridor of knowledge, but lessons for all of life. The second thing that is key in a traditional classical Orthodox education is the partnership with the parents. And we also put that forward first and foremost. We understand that the person who's chiefly responsible for teaching the children, the chief pedagogue is the parent. And we serve the parent, not the other way around. You see, in compulsory education, in state schools, in socialist settings, we have the idea that the state is responsible for the education. And so even in Greece today, it is illegal formally to do homeschooling because they consider that as their responsibility, the state's responsibility. So that is something that's very different in America. In America, surprisingly so, in some ways, all 50 states have confirmed that the parents are in charge of the education of the children and not the state. And that's why homeschooling in America is flourishing. We have 2.4 million children in America who are homeschooled. And there's a tremendous treasure of resources available online and in local communities. They're getting together. Many times Orthodox and Christian and Protestant and Roman Catholic are getting together in co-ops. They're working together to educate their children. And today we see a flourishing of online classical education sources. So you can go sign your children up, pay a fee, and you have twice a week through the internet a personal live teaching with a teacher. Could be 20, 10, 15, 30 kids in that classroom. You see online the kids who are there, their names are there. You can raise your hand and you can ask a question. You can see the teacher teach. You can see the blackboard. It's as close as you can imagine to a real classroom. They're meeting twice a week and they're doing things like logic, Latin, Greek, rhetoric, and all the other courses that one would need today in public education. And so that is happening in the tens of thousands in terms of courses being offered right now on the internet. So homeschooling is flourishing among Orthodox, Protestants, and Roman Catholics in the United States. So that is a key, if we're going to understand education properly, that the parent is going to give account at the second coming for the education of their child. It's very clear in Proverbs that you will give an account. You cannot say, well, the state took my child, I'm not responsible. That's not going to be an excuse at the second coming. You are responsible for raising your child in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and a big part of that is going to happen from the time they begin schooling until they go on to university, if they go on to the university. So we partner with the parents, and it's very important for us that we're there with them and we're close to them and they understand and they're a part of the education. Of course, that presupposes that they believe in the school and they want what we're offering. And that sometimes is a task in itself. I find myself educating or needing to educate sometimes the parents more than the children in terms of what an Orthodox school is all about. So this classical Christian, traditional, whatever you want to call it, Orthodox education, which really is with us from at least the 4th century on, follows again this so-called trivium, this grammar, logic, rhetoric stages. The grammar stage, we'll talk about the stages in a second, but the grammar stages from ages from 5 to, or let's say 1st to 4th grade, roughly. The dialectic or logic stages from 5th to 8th grade, and then 9th to 12th would be the rhetoric stage. We'll talk about a little bit what that means. We have that in common with everybody who's doing a classical education today. But, so we would, for instance, teach something like Homer, even though the content is problematic perhaps in some ways. The language has always been a part of the education of all of those who were educated in the Roman Empire, including St. Gregory Palamas, because of the language. And so there are certain texts which we're going to employ in an Orthodox Christian setting with the necessary presuppositions and discernment. But in many ways, Western classical education diverged from Orthodoxy and does not express the Orthodox phronema. And it's both in terms of the end. They don't have the common end of our education, which is going to be in the context of purification, illumination, and theosis, that whole, the life of Christ, and the means, how we get there, and the sources. what are our sources? We're going to have a divergence in all three ways, to lesser or greater degree. But in both ways, we're looking for the true, the good, and the beautiful. This is the phrase used very often in classical education. The question is unpacking the true, the good, and the beautiful, what it means and how we commune with it. There we have a divergence with the West. In the West, there is the so-called great books. The great books were more or less invented and created in the early 20th century, and it is a list of what you must read if you want to be an educated person. That's how they describe it. In other words, the great books are those immensely important texts written by philosophers, literature, authors, theologians, historians, and all the rest. And that forms the core and the sources for education. The problem is in the West that those great books from the schism on are going to be books that we're not going to want to have as listed as great books for us. We're not interested in filling our kids with thought which is contrary to Christ, even if it is considered a great book. There'd be a lot more reticence on the Orthodox part of including, without discernment, all of these texts, whereas in the West, there's not that kind of discernment present many times, and so those books are included, and those ideas are discussed. Sure, we're going to encounter those. Sure, we're going to debate those, but it's going to be more limited. And we have, in any case, our own great books, which are ignored in the West. Our writers, which have been never understood or forgotten. So there's a gap in the West between Augustine and Aquinas, for instance. We have St. Maximus the Confessor, St. Simeon the Theologian, St. Photius the Great, which is not present in the great books in the West. Or even after the schism, totally ignored in the West, you have St. Gregory Palamas, St. Nicodemus the Hagarite, St. Seraphim of Sarov, and all kinds of other writers. In Greek, you could include somebody like Papadiamantis, or in Russia, Dostoevsky, although many times Dostoevsky, you can find him in the West as well. So the sources differ. And then also our goal, our ultimate goal, and the means of attaining that differ. So we're not interested in what's called the great conversation. You know, this great conversation that's been happening in Western society between philosophers, theologians, and scientists per se. That's not our main interest, whereas that oftentimes is in the West, where they want to become a part of this great conversation of intellectuals. That's not really our goal. We want to have a great conversation, a truly great conversation, but not because we engage every prominent thinker, but rather because we are engaged by exceptionally inspired discourse of heavenly origins. The boast of Orthodox civilization is not the quantity of the works produced. You often hear that in classical circles in the West, nor the rate by which the ideas are exchanged, but rather the quality of the communion generated and the depth of the meaning attained. That's what we're interested in. It's better to have less, but go deeper, than to have more and have confusion and have diversion from the one thing needful. So our ultimate in Orthodox, in educational enlightenment, is not merely to produce good wise men, and much less good citizens. If this were the case, we would be impoverished as Orthodox. And the incarnation would be rather unnecessary if that was the goal of our education. Just as the law was our pedagogue until faith came, so too the end of education must be initiation into the Spirit, and the beginning of an endless ascent to divine humanity in the Church. Our great books could also be explained in the following way. We're not interested in the kind of knowledge that comes from academic research alone, but we want to be initiated into the truth in an experiential way. We want to bring forth people to the knowledge of the truth in a personal and communal way. You can talk about and describe truth in many ways, beauty and goodness, through the study of the great books, But unless one is personally communing with the truth, then this beauty, this truth, this goodness that they're discovering in their reading remains in the rational realm, and it's elusive as an experience. So the heart of the Orthodox school cannot be the study of great books, but the encounter with truth incarnate in the spiritual life, in the people who are teaching the children. The most important element is who's teaching and not what they're teaching, and of course in the divine liturgy and the whole spiritual life of the community. So it's not, this truth and beauty and goodness, which is the aim of classical education, is not attained primarily through the rational intellect, but through the nous, through the spirit of man. And it is clear that the means and the ends toward this are spiritual. So our educational paradigm is shaped and determined by our Orthodox soteriology, what salvation is about, by our gnoseology, or our understanding of knowledge. Our Orthodox understanding of the acquisition of knowledge is not just gnosis, which is kind of an intellectual knowledge about something, can be, but as St. Paul says in the Scriptures, epignosis, which is experiential knowledge. That's the basis of that's our paradigm in terms of knowledge. And if we understand that, then we better understand the role of academic education, or the so-called liberal arts, in the Orthodox context. You see, it takes on a different role, it's more limited and more particular, and it works together with the development of the Spirit and not apart from it. In most places, even in the best classical education, what we're talking about is an academic acquisition of knowledge and not a spiritual encounter with truth. So we'll talk quickly about the trivium, the so-called trivium, which is the Latin term for this threefold educational process that people would go through educationally, academically, in classical education. We said the first is grammar, and that comes from the Greek word grammatikos, and it means basically the art of using and combining symbols to express thought. This is the building blocks of knowledge. This is why the grammar stage is the first 4 years, when kids are disposed to learning about and acquiring with numbers and with histories and with dates. This is the time period that we need to give them the raw material of education. We're not going to engage them in terms of the rational argumentation, the logic stage. We're not going to expect from them rhetoric, expressing of ideas. That's not what's going to happen in the first 4 years. We're going to give them the basics, the building blocks. They're going to be filled with that, and then when they reach a maturity, the next stage, they're going to pass from that into the art of thinking, and that's the dialectic stage. That's the logic stage. So here they learn the mechanics of thought and analysis, the art of formal and material reasoning. That's the dialectic stage. We're talking about 6th through 8th or 9th grades. And then the rhetoric stage is the final stage in the trivium. So that's where we're getting to the high school, and now they've got the building blocks. They've honed their rational understanding, their logic, their dialectic, and it's time to express and to apply the knowledge they've acquired in order to instruct and to persuade. And this is very important in classical education. St. Gregory Palamas, if you remember from his life, when he was 18, and just before he left for the monastery, he presented in front of dignitaries in the court, and his teacher said famously, "I did not know if I was in front of Socrates or in front of my student," something like this. The rhetoric was the sign that somebody was educated. He could express himself, persuade others, and the knowledge, the understanding, was then transmitted as wisdom. And this meant the person had arrived at wisdom. We could put it more simply, grammar pertains to the thing as it is, symbolized. Dialectic as the thing it pertains to the thing as it is known, and rhetoric to the thing as it is communicated. So it's symbols, knowledge, and communication. This is the process by which one becomes an educated human being. If we were to stop there, we would pretty much have described classical education as it's lived out and understood among the non-Orthodox. But we have to add much more, and we have to actually give the heart now. We've talked about the head and the rational intellect and its development, which is essential. But where's the heart? Where's the spirit? And here we have the threefold, let's say, trivium or threefold program of purification, illumination, and deification. If we didn't have that, the trivium is vanity. It's not salvific. It could actually puff one up and lead him into delusion. And this is the danger with academic, intellectual, rational knowledge, is that if it's not combined with spiritual ascent, with purification from the passions, with humility and all the virtues, it is working against our salvation. And so it's key that at the core of our Orthodox school, we have the spiritual trivium, or spiritual threefold process of formation. So toward achieving the overall formation of the child, and precisely because there should be no compartmentalization and thus secularization of the children's lives, the academy has to have as a central role the overall furtherance of the children's spiritual ascent. And so if you're building a school and the parents want to send their kids to this school, everyone has to be on the same page here. If they are expecting their kids to go just to a better school, a school that does things in a nice Orthodox context, but they're not expecting spiritual formation, then what are we doing? We haven't done an Orthodox school. We're not on the path of Orthodox education. The core has to be the therapy, the restoration of the spirit of man, the nous of man. If the academic trivium is meant to bring the rational intellect to a knowledge of creation, the spiritual trivium is essential for the spirit of man, the nous, to come to an experiential knowledge of God. Whereas the formal schooling process of learning is necessarily limited, the process of returning to God and increasing the depth of communion with Him has a beginning, but it has no end. And therefore, the school is just the beginning of this whole process. So when the ultimate aim, the ultimate goal of salvation in Christ is purposefully sought in the spiritual process of purification, illumination, and glorification, then the academic trivium comes as a firm support and itself finds its fulfillment. So these two have to go together. It's like body and soul. Otherwise, you do not have an Orthodox school. What's the aim of a traditional Orthodox education? Simply put, within the Orthodox fullness and the freedom of Christ, a critical and creative thinker is in a position to decipher the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. So we're teaching people not just what they need to know. We're not just preparing them to be a part of a system, to get a job. We're teaching them how to learn and continually learn throughout their whole life. Learning how to learn. That's what's going on in an Orthodox context. We're freeing them so that they can be themselves free of the shackles of this age. To throw off the shackles, to make the faith and truth of the church his own, to live for Christ with his whole mind, heart, and soul. That's the goal of an Orthodox education. It's exactly the opposite is what my experience, my understanding of state compulsory education. It's not to free them, but to enslave them and to make them a part of the system, which is the system ultimately which will serve the Antichrist at the end of the day. So we have to be very clear the goal of our school, and that is freedom from the shackles of the age, not simply preparation to serve the society which is being formed. One of the methods, the key methods in this whole process is, and I think it's an important method which has to be, let's say, baptized by the Orthodox, but it is an important method for creating creative thinkers, and that is the Socratic method. The Socratic method, which, if it's done correctly, far from encouraging, let's say, thinkers that are not, do not have a goal, because many people think of the Socratic method as just getting together and everybody telling their opinion. Far from it. Obviously, Socrates was not about just the opinions of others, but about the truth. So the Socratic method is a way of taking that inner discussion that's going on in the student and directing it toward the truth. It's a methodology which is very important. Enough on the theory of the curriculum and education. Let's talk about some practical aspects, and then we can open it up for questions and answers. I'm going to give you what I think, and I'm going to take largely from an important Orthodox academic educator today. His name is David Hicks. He's written a book called Norms and Nobility. I highly recommend it. Anybody who's going to be your academic dean or chair needs to read it at their school. Norms and Nobility. He was an educator in the classical Western context for decades. He was in Athens, and then now he's back in America. He became an Orthodox Christian, I'm not sure when, maybe about a decade ago, and he's been writing and talking to Orthodox people about an Orthodox education. And so largely, I'm going to take from him because I like it, and I think it's expressive of the Orthodox phronema on this question. And he gives 7 traits of an Orthodox education, 7 traits of an Orthodox school. And here's the first. And I'm going to comment as we go, adding a few of my own thoughts. The first and most important thing, of course, are the relationships that's built in the school. And that means the teacher. The teacher is the most important. If you have a school that has teachers who are not living the spiritual life, do not have an Orthodox phronema, do not understand what the end of Orthodox education is about, you do not have an Orthodox school. The school is as good as its teachers. The school is as good as its teachers. So, the first and foremost, we have to have a faithful and spiritually mature Orthodox group of teachers. And they need to demonstrate their love in actions for the children. That's number one. Number two is that we need to develop Orthodox Christian community. It's one of the biggest missing pieces of the puzzle in our Orthodox life today. Because we live in a society which is individualistic, which is compartmentalized, which is disintegrating community. The whole structure of Western, especially America and Australia and other places, is a community that does not have roots, does not have an identity, and we are all individuals, and their community is being lost. So we have to create, the Orthodox school is a tremendous opportunity for the church to increase the community, to bind together the children from a young age in their Orthodox identity. And they must cease to exist as individuals, and their relationships with God and one another has to come alive. And that's really important. It needs to be a conscious goal of the school to create community. And that's exactly what I'm seeing happen in Arizona, that immediately the school has gathered together the community. So the community was there. There were a lot of people living around the monastery, but the monastery is not a parish. So one of the things that we've seen immediately is that this missing link for all of those faithful who've come to be close to the monastery is that they have immediately an Orthodox community. And people are getting together, parents are getting together, and it's an opportunity for the parents to be catechized. It's an opportunity for the children to have guidance outside of their home by an Orthodox educator, and for that community to become a reality. So number two would have to be Orthodox community. Number three, well, before I say that, there's a wonderful historical example that Dr. Hicks mentions, and let me just share that with you. And I didn't know about this until I read his writings. In the 4th century, there was a school in Nisibis, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It was reestablished by St. Ephrem the Syrian in Edessa after this city fell to the Persians. And the supreme authority in the school was exercised in community meetings where the students, because of their numbers, had the deciding vote and elected the educators, or the head of the educators. They handled, the people who handled, in other words, all the finances and operations of the school, as well as the discipline. So the head of the school was the rector, the spiritual guide, and the director of studies. No one could be expelled from the school without a vote of the community. And if you just consider that a minute, this means they had a high degree of trust between teachers and students. And this was something that I think is definitely something we should imitate. The students need to be a part and feel that they own the school. They need to be a part of the school. It should not be something that they just come to and leave, and they're not. They need to help clean up. They need to help raise money for the school. They need to be a part of the whole process. And that's a great example from church history, which I did not know about. Number 3, it is key that we have the right criteria for choosing the content or the sources that the children are going to be reading. And one of the keys here is that they have a vertical. Whatever they're going to read doesn't have to be Orthodox material. It can't be, because there's not enough Orthodox material in English language for us to provide. So we're going to be using non-Orthodox sources whether we like it or not, and the question has to be, our criteria has to be how, and on what basis do we choose what we're going to use? Well, there has to be a vertical dimension. There has to be God a part of the story, or we should not include it at all. And much of the material that's being used in contemporary education is godless. It's only horizontal. It's not vertical. So that has to be the basic prerequisite. Whatever we bring in has to be. And so there are sources out there that we can use. And we're going back in our school, we're actually doing historical research right now. I have teachers that I've given this task. They're going back to the 19th century texts. They're going back to 1840s for math texts. We're going back to McGuffey Readers, which was a 19th century series of educational and English texts. And we're seeing what they were doing, because we believe that after this renovation in education, especially at the end of the 19th century, we had a perversion, a distortion, and an undermining of education. So phonics, for instance, went out the window, and people became more and more illiterate. They knew how to read, but they didn't read, and they don't read today. There are many illiterate people in the 20th century, which is very strange and odd that you have people who cannot read. And phonics was the system in place, the way of learning how to read for young children, and we're using phonics. That's just one example. You can go back and you can see how they did mathematics. And so we're getting back to the tried and traditional and old ways of educating, and we're going to start incorporating that next year. In addition to this, a text should not, of course, celebrate sin in any way. And it should put forth the virtues. That would be other criteria for what kind of text we should incorporate in educational process. And I would say, and I would agree with Dr. Hicks, who says the same thing, but we've said this many times in our school as well, throw out textbooks. Maybe not for mathematics or science, but definitely for English, definitely for history. Throw out textbooks, get to the sources. Have the children come into contact directly with sources, with the literature of the day, with the historical sources used to write the history books. If you are teaching the children with textbooks, you have an intermediary between the child and the history or the source that you're introducing. You have, in other words, a gatekeeper who's going to keep them from a direct encounter, and that's a totally different education. So for instance, if you're reading about the Middle Ages, read about the Middle Ages. Read sources from the Middle Ages. We have that in our disposal. We don't have to have a 20th century academic who's writing about the Middle Ages teach us about the Middle Ages. We should go right to the sources. And at the very least, if there is a need for a textbook, there's plenty of good traditional Christian, heterodox, in this context, sources that we can choose that are better than what they're using in the public schools. So we have to bravely trodden the path that is not taken by the majority. Number 4, We need to be sure and know that there is no academic disadvantage to our students in failing to study the cultural sources that are filling our society today. We don't need to follow the Joneses and read what they're reading. And there's not going to be any academic problem if we do that. We can find our own sources, our own way of imparting culture and knowledge. It's not only because the works we study in Orthodox schools are more demanding, more full of meaning, richer and closer to the source, but because the most researched and data-supported educational theory declares it so. In other words, what you teach is not nearly as important as how you teach it. This is Dr. Hicks's conclusion, and I wholeheartedly agree. We focus a lot on the what, and we don't understand it's about how you teach and who is teaching. It's far more important than the what you're teaching. And the whole classical education approach, the whole traditional Christian approach could be summed up is we're interested in teaching them how to fish and not just giving them a fish to eat. And that's the very different approach to what's going on in most education today. Dr. Hicks says the following, which I like to quote. It's very good in terms of rational thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, which of course is an aim of the school. He says, we ought to have clear instructional protocols that ask all teachers to use an interrogatory method based on high-order reasoning. He says, and explains himself, the teacher needs to identify the essential questions for every lesson. So you go into a lesson, you know what to ask. That's a part of the Socratic method. If you're going to get them to think deeply and to have critical thought and not just be passive receptors regurgitating what the teacher said, we don't want that. You know, most of education today is educating for the test. Most of the education is preparing somebody to take a test. This is a terrible way of educating. It undermines true love of knowledge, and it creates people who are indifferent to truth. So we want them to have critical thinking, and questions are the key. The educator has to ask the right questions, and many times we don't want to just give them food. Here it is, here's the truth. No, they need to be troubled, they need to be challenged, they need to be provoked to think about and understand and come to the knowledge of the truth on their own, expending a lot of energy to do that. A teacher needs to do this. It needs to use differentiated strategies in instruction. There's a variety of strategies, not just one-dimensional, not just lectures, not just discussion, but a variety of things to keep education lively. Never complete a lesson without a high-order assessment. In other words, at the end, you have to bring it back and summarize and present the conclusion so we have closure and we have a clear understanding. Without this, the teacher will not build the critical thinking, complex problem-solving, high-order reasoning skills that the people need today if they're going to be free of the zeitgeist, if they're going to be also very successful in terms of their future. And they won't be faithful to the best traditions of Orthodox Christians. He says, remember, we are nurturing humans, not automatons, I should say. Creatures whom their Creator made in His own image with reasoning minds and free wills. The conclusions that our students come to after having weighed all the evidence and heard all the arguments are those that will guide them against the intellectual fads and fancies of the world, at the same time as providing them with the critical tools to tackle any new topic or question with confidence and discernment. And yet, at the same time, and this is number 5, we have 5, 6, and 7, and then I'm going to open up for questions. At the same time, Dr. Hicks says, we have a theology of history. We have a narrative that culminates in the Incarnation, starts with the Incarnation and culminates in the Incarnation, Passion, Resurrection, Second Coming, all of these events in time that made everything new. So we're not just wandering through history. We have the Alpha and the Omega. We understand where we're coming from, where we're going. And I would say at the center then of everything has to be that we organize the school along the church calendar, its feasts and its fasts, its saints' days, its readings, from the gospel, epistles, the lives of the saints. This is a part of our school curriculum, our school life. It ought to some extent reflect the prayers of the church. The books we study should either draw on the themes of our narrative and God's redemptive work in history. They should call attention to the shallowness and the emptiness and the depravity of the world absent God, the godless world that we live in, and the hope and the redemption in Christ. It needs to have both. You can't just talk about Christ and have a positive assessment. You do need a critique. You do need critical thinking. You do need, at times, even, I would say, this is my own addition, mockery of the absurdity of much of what is passing as civilized society today. The children need to have that protection. They need to have that critical thinking. I've introduced at the high school, for the high school kids, last semester I taught this, the Orthodox Survival Course by Father Seraphin Rose, which I highly recommend you all read, as it is an assessment of the whole process of the apostasy, how we've arrived, why we've arrived, and how we've arrived at what we have in the Western world. It goes back all the way to the schism, and he explains step by step the process of dissolution of the Christian vision in the West, and it is all connected. It's not at all isolated. What we're living in the 21st century is connected all the way back to the 11th century. Father Seraphin Rose lays it out, and it's online. It's free for download. Orthodox Survival Course. These were lectures he gave to young men in the 1970s, and it was a fruit of all his research that he had done before and after becoming an Orthodox Christian. That's the kind of thing that we should bring to the Orthodox school. That kind of critical thinking, that kind of Orthodox phronema and worldview, which assesses everything and gives us the alpha and the omega. If we don't have that, then we're lost in history. We will not understand what's happening to us. We will not understand the society we live in. And if our children go out there without that understanding, they're going to be victims of this zeitgeist, of this spirit of the age that we're living through. We should be very clear, Dr. Hicks says, that the state's narrative, the state school's narrative, is much more shocking, much more anti-historical than ours. Because many times people say, well, if that's what you're doing in there, this is not education, this is indoctrination. This is one of the things you might hear from somebody who talks about an Orthodox school. You're indoctrinating people. You're not allowing them to free. And in fact, it's just the opposite. They're getting indoctrination in the state schools. We're not more doctrinaire than the state schools, wherein religion is prescribed topic. You don't talk about God in the state schools. He's never mentioned, and of course, God as the God of history is not a part of the educational process. So we are far freer, and we actually free people from the chains. And so we should not have any kind of complex that we need to, when people accuse us of teaching doctrine and teaching a vision of the world, and as if they're not doing the same thing in the state schools. They're doing it, and they're bringing people into nihilism, hopelessness, because there's no God, there's no end point to their life without God. The sixth point here, and then we'll quickly end with the seventh. He says here, the ancient Greeks who invented the school, as you probably all know, the ancient Greeks invented the school system, education, as to say, did not distinguish in their language between education and culture. When seeing the word paideia in Greek, modern English translators have to decide from the context whether to write education or culture. It's interchangeable in Greek. That's very instructive for us. It's an important lesson. Culture is the most profound education of all. So our schools have to be about producing Orthodox culture, the Orthodox ethos, the Orthodox way of life. If all we do is give them education, and even Orthodox education, we've failed. They have to go, when they go to school, they have to go and feel they're entering into a whole culture, a whole way of living and understanding, and it has to pervade everything. And it is perpetually indoctrinating and educating us whether we are aware of it or not. think of the profound effects of television and video games and social media have on our children. This is the kind of culture that we're living in. All of that is educating our children. The television and everything that's going on in modern media is educating, and it's culture. And so the same thing has to happen in the Orthodox context if we're going to have any success. If we fail in that, then we're going to fail the children, because it's not going to be enough to resist the temptations of the world. The temple, of course, is the center of that, right? The worship is, of course, the center of this culture. It has to be the divine liturgy, and the worship has to be the center. So there are unique traditions in the Orthodox Church which shape our taste, our habits, and our attitudes, and that should be a part of the Orthodox school's mission. Finally, Dr. Hicks suggests, and I think this is something that would be a very practical as well as important pedagogical end. When education ends, when they're ending their time in the Orthodox school before they go on to other things, it should all be summarized. It should be a culminating course of reflection back upon all that they have learned, and ideally, the Orthodox priest or bishop or monk should be at the center of that culminating process. He should be there to guide them and make sense of and unify everything they've learned. And including in that should be contact with the monastery, an essay explaining everything they've learned. They need to summarize and look at it all as a united whole, and not as a bunch of knowledge and not as a bunch of experiences. But they need to make sense of that at the end, and that will be something that will be with them the rest of their life. So that is largely taken from Dr. Hicks, which I agree with, I appreciate, and it is very helpful for us in understanding practically what this school should be about. So I hopefully I've given you a sense of the struggle of what it means to open up a school, how important it is for our church today everywhere to open up schools, what a academic curriculum would be like, what principles it would be based on, and then some practical important aspects of what an Orthodox school contains. And this can be food for thought and hopefully lots of good questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dostojno jest Jakowo i Synu, Blażytya Bogorodicu, Prysno Blaženuju i Preporočnuju, imate Boga naszego, česniejšuju kerovim i slavniejšuju bez sravnjenja serafim, bez istenija Boga slova rošuju, sučuju Bogorodicu tja veličaje.
Orthodox school prepare her students to pass these exams and access the secondary education?
That's a good question. So in the United States, the equivalent of that is the SAT. I don't know if you've heard of that, the SAT. It's ACT. There's different tests. I think pretty much every state, every country has something like this, which then on the basis of, not only, but mainly on the basis of that, you're going to be entering the university of your choice in America. There's a lot of private institutions in America. And the question, and education in America, and I guess it's like this in Australia, is really gauged toward that exam. They're preparing you for that, and they're they want you to get good scores because it's going to come back to them in state money and all kinds of things. And the question is, what does an Orthodox school, how does an Orthodox school approach that, the success of our students on those exams? They should not, I repeat, not teach to the exam. Because the fact of the matter is, in public education, it's all dumbed down. The standards are lower than a classical Orthodox education. The things that they're doing to prepare you are much less than if you would just focus on a traditional Christian classical education. If you do that, you're going to do fine on the exam. And I have a lot of examples, personally, which prove that. In a classical education, from a young age, you're learning Greek and Latin. If you learn Greek and Latin well, 2, 4, 5 years of Greek and Latin, you're going to fly on the English part of that exam. It's going to be easy. It's going to be easy because when you learn Latin, for instance, you have learned all the etymology and the words, how they're made up, and you go deeper into the meaning of everything you're reading, whatever story you're reading. So it gives you much more than this dumbed-down state education, which has to be dumbed down, right? It has to be the lower common denominator because they're not interested in producing, in working with that 2 or 3 or 5 students of the 30 and running with them and bringing them higher and higher. They have to keep everybody at the level of the medium at least, if not lower. So there's no reason to have any anxiety on the part of an Orthodox school that, oh my gosh, how are we going to prepare them for the exam? They're going to do better on the exam and without any need to follow the standards of the state, because the standards of the state are lower and intentionally so. So I think if you're following this classical education, the trivium, you're learning the languages, you're learning to express yourself in rhetoric and think logically and all the rest, you're going to do fine on the exam. And I have personal examples of that. My son did extremely well, and he never went through any public education and did not prepare for the SAT in any particular way. So I don't think that's a good question because that's one of the big questions my parents had. How am I going to get into college? How am I going to do the SAT? And there's unreasonable anxiety for that. Just we don't know. We don't have knowledge, and so we think that there's some kind of need to do what they're doing in the state schools. Thank you for the question. Another question? Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. A lot of great points. One that I sort of wanted to ask in particular, I forget which point it is. The point was throw out the textbooks.
Yes.
And I agree, and I think that's excellent. Keep it small and go high instead of something broad, and how we essentially dumb out the SAT or HSC. We sort of keep some uniform level. I agree with that. I want to ask you, just quickly, Father, forgive me if I said anything wrong or haven't understood properly. You said that we should throw out the textbooks and we should have some sort of approach with the teacher instead of having that textbook sort of explanation to the source. As you said, we should go straight to the source, understand the source, and then discuss the source. With any sort of things in my spiritual life or anyone else, we have our fathers to explain things to us from the earlier fathers, and he explains it through them. He's not sort of explaining anything new or making anything up. Now, as the educator, I have confidence in them, but I just want you, if you could just go a bit deeper into it. When that teacher reads the source and then the classroom discusses what that source actually means, it's more or less what that teacher understands about the source. But if we have something about confession, the fathers, 10 of them will agree, okay, this is what the confession actually means, and this is what it is, and they've said yes, that's it. So now if we have a text, I don't know, whatever that may be, or aboriginals or history or whatever, and then when the teacher reads that, he obviously, or he or she understands it as best as she can or he can as an Orthodox, and then they explain that to the teacher from their behalf. So what they understand.
So you're saying basically the teacher becomes the intermediary like a textbook would.
They do, but I want to know what it is that, how can we not make sure, but back it up sort of thing, you know, like the early fathers, all the fathers, they backed it up to say.
Well, you're looking for some kind of guarantee or kind of some, no, yeah.
Sorry, not a guarantee, just to understand if the source is what it means, you know, like if we understand.
So you have a source, you have a text, the Bible, or some kind of patristic teaching, or any kind of philosophical text or any kind of literary text, the student's going to come into contact with that. He's going to read it on his own, and the role of the teacher is going to be, depending on the age group, if it's an older age group, it won't really be much lecturing at all. It'll be discussion, guided discussion, the Socratic method, so that the students are exploring with a guide. Now, obviously, the guide, as I said in the beginning, the first and most important person is the teacher. And the guide has to be a spiritually mature, faithful, educated Orthodox Christian. Otherwise, the school is not going to have success. So the presupposition here is that that teacher is not only have an experience, which will then guide them in the interpretation, but they're going to be resting on their interpretation of the saints and of the church and of the collective wisdom of the church. So those two things are going to guide them: their personal experience, the patristic guidance or witness, so it's not going to be a free-for-all. It's not going to be my opinion. It's not going to be, like there's some Bible studies you can, I think sometimes people do Bible studies, even some Orthodox, and it's, tell me how you feel when you read that text. That's not the Orthodox approach. No one cares about our own feelings or our own perspectives in that sense. We're looking to enter into the meaning of the authors and what he's trying to communicate to us. And we're looking at that in the context of the truth which is incarnate and the truth which is taught in the church. So in that context, I don't see any kind of major intermediary who's going to mislead us, the danger. Now, if you don't have those presuppositions, you don't have that context, of course, there's going to be problems. And it's, again, the most important decision you're going to make as a school and as the dean of the school is who are your teachers. And I would say my experience is that's something you should spend a lot of time on and think deeply and do a lot of work to find the best teachers before you open up the school. And of course, the dean is the most important decision of all, that they're going to have the vision that we're laying out here. It's a difficult time for us because, as I said, we're pathfinders to something which doesn't exist as a whole, ready-made, ready to go. We're taking it collectively, we're collecting it, rather, all the wisdom that we see, but we're still having to form that and put it in practice. And so it's a process to arrive at the point where we have surety and clarity, and we're going to be able to initiate the kids into that wisdom that we want to give them in the text. Any other question? Somebody else? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Just a question. So you spoke about the trivium, the three stages up to roughly year 12. Is there, from memory, Plato's Republic, I think you got up to age 50. Is there
Age?
50?
50, 50.
I think so.
I don't remember that.
Wrong, but anyway,
Yeah.
is there a university version of your model that continues on to university stage?
So after the trivium, there's the quadrivium, which would be the sciences in the ancient world, which are different than contemporary. Quadrivium would have been astronomy, would have been geometry, would have been these kind of things. And then after that, there would have been a select few who would have gone on to philosophy. And philosophy would have been the final stage of an education for somebody even up to the fall of the empire in the 15th century. Is that what you're looking for? I don't know of any other. There's not that developed 19th, 20th century. There's very extensive developed system of PhDs and post-PhDs and all that. You don't see that. There's not that breadth of subject matter because they didn't have the things we have today in terms of what to learn. So you have to adapt this to contemporary society. You can't just stick with what they were doing 500 years ago. There are other things to learn. But the goal is not to give them quantitatively knowledge. The goal is to initiate them into the wisdom and the understanding so that they continue to learn throughout their life. So we're not going to be obsessed with filling their brains with material. It's not a true education. That doesn't rest on that. So they were pretty narrow. At the top, at the pinnacle of the pyramid was philosophy. In other words, the whole quest of wisdom and understanding. In the Orthodox context, it would be including theology and Orthodox teachings of the fathers. Father, you had a question?
I was just going to make a bit of a comment here because
Yes.
to localise the discussion
Yes.
with respect to school education here. There are in state schools, and in fact this does affect all independent schools, whether they're religious or philosophical based schools. You, at the end of your education, when you sit for this higher school certificate, depending on the subjects that you have chosen to study, in particular through the last years of high school, you have to sit one exam that the entire state of New South Wales sits for on the same day at the same hour
Yes, yes.
for the same period of time. And there are, for example, there will be an English test for level 1, level 2, or level 3 English, whatever they might call it these days. And you will sit for one of these English tests, one of these maths tests at different levels, also in history and in the STEM subjects like chemistry, physics, and mathematics. The problem with the humanities is that those subjects and the way those tests are structured, you have to have read, for example, for an English exam, you have to have read certain texts. You have to be familiar with these particular novels, with these particular poets and their works. And as the years roll on, the curriculum prescribes worse and worse and more diabolical texts that you just can't imagine. There is a lot of breadth there, however. There's a lot of breadth. There are a lot of things you can include when you're running an independent school, and then the Department of Education is obliged to cover texts that will be covered that will be employed in the education of children in specialised or religious schools. But that's only part of the problem. It's the question. How do you answer this question? If I can just depart, because I know this from my own experience. My daughter was at university and was asked they had to do a study of Othello.
Mm-hmm.
For a start, they never entered the time or the mind of the writer of William Shakespeare. They knew his surname only. They never knew his name was William, it was just Shakespeare. They were told, you are not to read the text. You are to watch so-and-so's movie adaptation of this, right? And then you are to compare. You are not to read the text at all. You must watch this movie and this person's adaptation of Othello, and compare this movie with a movie called Monsters, which was about some South African lesbian serial killer. Yes.
That's okay. That's okay.
And you are to compare issues of the oppression of women, sexism, and all these cultural, in the modern sense of cultural, all of these cultural social phenomena. There's nothing about Othello in there. It was all about actually just looking at issues of oppression of women, and all those kind of social justice causes. That's how they study Othello these days.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, what do you do in the...
So how do you prepare your children who are, we will probably have this issue as well when we get to the stage where our kids are going to the high school, if the world hasn't collapsed completely by then, and things are heading that way. But we will have to face this problem, and we will have to navigate through this. So what you have said about the choice of director of school and academic staff and everything else is critically important, because not everybody can be the captain of the ship.
Yeah.
But you have to save the entire passenger body.
Yes.
Right? So we have to have a good captain.
Yes.
And there are ways to navigate through it. We have to use all of those things that we will gain and garner from a classical education to help us and the student body find their way through it, because ultimately that's what they're going to have to do when they enter the world, is find their own way and maintain their own path on the journey to salvation.
So the problem you're presenting is not unlike the problem presented already in society in terms of a workplace or a job when they were requiring similar views to be accepted. So it's just in this context. And I think that, yes, there is this practical way of getting through the hoops and making it happen. I'm sure that there's a way that the school can stay true to its vision, and yet if they know particularly they have to deal with this text and that text and the other text, they have special sessions with students who are going to prepare for the test and get them through it. So there's ways to practically...
That's part of
yeah,
education.
Yeah, that is. That, God forbid that become a part of the true education of the school, but practically trying to help the kids through the hoops. That's one option. I think, though, it's going to be, we're exponentially jumping ahead, okay? Time is passing exponentially fast. It's not like 100 years ago because of technology, because of the political system and all the rest. And I don't think it's too far in the future when even that option will be very problematic. And we have to prepare ourselves, whether it's in the school setting or whether it's in the society, to say what are the boundaries where we say we don't need that. And I know it's not going to be popular. You're starting a school, you want to get them into college, but I guarantee you, humanly speaking, if I can do that, that will be a question, a real question, 5 or 10 years down the road. It's going to be eventually, at some point, it'll be a question: are we a part of this, or are we not a part of this? Now, for the time being, we can get through the hoops, I hope, but it's a matter of time until we're going to be faced with hard choices, hard sayings, like in the gospel, because they're going to ask us to regurgitate lies about man and God to be able to pass those tests. And what are we going to do?
It's not so extreme in high school as it is at university.
Yeah.
I mean, you really have to think twice about going to university, except if you're going to study medicine or mathematics.
Yeah.
You really have to think very
So in Australia, there's no private universities.
No, there are.
Oh, and they're free to teach what they like?
Well, yes and no.
Uh-huh.
Yes and no.
And there's no options for Christian education and higher education?
There are, but you go to the Australian Catholic University, and their qualifications are not. We have a similar problem to America. If you study medicine at the Australian Catholic University, which attempts to maintain its mainline Christian vision, you can't get a job in a public hospital. You can only get a job in a Catholic hospital.
Mm-hmm.
They don't recognise your qualifications.
Yeah.
And there are certain other institutions that won't recognise other qualifications if they come from a Catholic.
So it reminds me of the Pharisees who we have to make the decision: are we going to be put out of the synagogue? Are we going to accept that as and go with the Lord outside the gate or not? I mean, that's the kind of decisions that are going to be coming down the road.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I ask you? I've been talking.
Yes.
Can I ask you a question? What about the manual arts, the fine arts?
Absolutely.
Sport in your school?
Yes, absolutely. We're trying to develop all of that. I'm sorry I couldn't address everything, but so we're trying to introduce. We have sacred chant as a class for all of our high school kids. We have 3 times a week they learn to chant. We have a teacher from Greece. I want to add iconography. I want to add other sacred art. Absolutely. I want to add. We're going to develop the athletics aspect, but of course it's very basic now because we don't have the facilities. So that's all part of our education. Absolutely. We want to actually add. I should have added this in my talk. Next semester, I want to have after school. Let's say like home economics. Back in the day when they would teach you to sew, they would teach you to be a homemaker, to teach you to fix cars, all the practical stuff, to plant, that you have a garden, woodwork, all this stuff that we're not being taught today. We're becoming useless academics, intellectuals who can't use their hands. So that's got to be a part of our education as well. And that's going to be introduced initially as an after-school option for the kids and for the community. That's our goal for next semester. So yeah, all of that's going to be going forward. That's going to be a part of our educational, not just the rational academics, but practical things kids need to learn. Very much so. Yes, sir. You have a question?
Just very quickly,
Yeah.
You've actually included that part of it in what you're doing
Yes.
overseas. But the great thing is that we've got an opportunity now to work on your experiences and to build those experiences into what we're doing here. Coming back to the thing that I mentioned last time, would you go again, please?
Yes.
With the dissipation of the community away from the church in America, the experience with the Greeks there, and reiterate to perhaps the people that weren't there last night, how important that is that we do have these sorts of institutions, these vehicles for the future.
So, first of all, about the parents, I think that there's great need for schools for parents, schools that teach them. We don't necessarily learn that. Who learns to be a parent until they start being a parent? So that's a big part of it. It would be very helpful if there were particular classes offered to help them understand what it means to be an Orthodox Christian parent today. Secondly, they need to be very much in part of the school, and they need to own it. It needs to be a communal thing. They need to come and volunteer and work at the school and help promote the school and all the rest of it. It has to be, otherwise it won't be successful. Thirdly, the question of the future and what's happening sociologically, my understanding, I've read this and I believe it to be true, they did a survey or some kind of study of the Greek descendants of Greek immigrants in America. What percentage remained Orthodox? And it was a startling conclusion. It was 80% had left the church. 80% of the descendants of the immigrants had left the church, or either totally indifferent or became Protestants or became whatever, something else than Orthodox. And the question is, why? Why did so many people in the Greek Archdiocese leave the church? Let's say it's 50%. It's still an amazing number. 50% left the church, let's say. And I think a good part of it is the refusal of the church to deal with the reality that you have to put roots down where you are and provide shade spiritually for them in the place that they're living. Whether you like it or not, the second and third and fourth generation is going to call that place home, and they're going to look at that as their identity increasingly. That's the fruit of immigration. It's very clear in the book of Ruth and other places that when that happens, that's going to be the fruit. Now, pastorally, we can close our mind to that and say, let's double down on our ethnic identity. And some people will embrace that. Many won't. And the percentages in America show it. So you've got to learn, figure out a way to feed immediately in the culture and language of the people, and at the same time, start to develop a program for the day after, for the next stage, for the children and the children's children, that they own it and it's identified. And that means mission. That means outreach. That means that the church is by its nature making disciples. Not just preaching, not just teaching, making disciples. That's very different. A disciple means initiation into the mystery. It means someone who is obedient and submits to the church. It's one that acquires the mind of Christ. There's no easy solution. We're attacked on all sides spiritually. We've got demonic onslaught in terms of what's going on in our society around us. But nonetheless, we have the truth, and when you preach the truth prophetically, people find peace. I think that's what I've learned, is that when the prophetic voice of Christ is taught, is communicated, people embrace it and they find meaning. I mean, what is all this going on around us? It's nihilism, it's meaninglessness. That's what's going on around us. They don't know where they're going, they don't know where they've come. They've lost the Alpha and the Omega, and they're at sea in philosophies and theories and demonic activities. So we have the upper hand in many ways, but because we're either silent or because we're afraid to speak the truth to our own people, say, look, this is what we got to do, and you're gonna have to deal with it. We don't want to go there. It's comfortable. We're comfortable, we think, but it's not going to last forever. Now, getting back to the school a minute, I wanted to say, and I neglected to say it earlier, at the heart of the education in the Orthodox context and it's a change from this trivium, is the lives of the saints. It's the lives of the saints. We're going to be doing the following in our education. The first 4 years, we're not going to talk about history much. We're not going to talk about science much. We're not going to go into other cultures and traditions. We're going to look and we're going to focus on examples of virtue for the children. And that's going to be the basis of their whole education. So that everything else they're taught later on, when they meet other cultures, other traditions, other peoples, it's going to be filtered through the vision of Christ in history, the continuation of the incarnation in the lives of the saints. That's going to be their criteria. And that's the first 4 years are the most important in terms of education. Most important. You got to lay that foundation then. And without that, I think that the whole rest of their education is going to be in danger of being one-sided, lopsided, rationalistic, and the Spirit of God's not going to, the leaven is not going to be there. And so that's why every morning after prayer in our church, in our school, all the kids gather in the main area, 52 kids, and I begin and I teach them the life of the saint of the day. And I don't just do it in terms of opening the book and reading it to them. I have a large screen behind me. I use Google Map and I say, let's go from Arizona, and we fly down to wherever the saint lived. And I say, here's where the saint lived. And I begin, here's look at our timeline. You see the timeline? I talk to them again and again about the timeline. I want them to get the whole sense of the history of the church. And I say, where is the 4th century? Show me the 4th century. Here's where this saint lived in the 4th century. And I talk about the 4th century. They get the context, time and space. This saint lived in time and space like Christ. He came into our world and lived like us. In other words, implicitly, I'm teaching them, you can be like him. This is not for the monks at Athos. It's for every one of us. And then we begin and we look at the icon of the saint. They see that it's a human being just like them. And then we begin to go through the life of the saint and we focus on the virtues of the saint. And we say, this is what the saint did. This is how they lived. And then I recap it and I say, now you tell me, what virtues did you see in the life of the saint? How can we imitate the virtues of the saint so that we can become like them? And that's how we begin every day in our school. That's the foundation. And I think that's got to be happening in our lives, not just in our school. That's how we should begin our day in our life. We should have the synaxarion and lives of the saints open continually before us. Otherwise, all these other bad examples are going to delude us and confuse us and drag us down. We've got to shut those out. Turn off the television, turn off all the garbage, and focus on the lives of the saints and imitating them. And I think if, God willing, we stay afloat, the first 3 years are the hardest time. If you can stay afloat for 3 years, they say, the school will continue for a long time. So the first 3 years are the hardest. If we can stay afloat, if these kids stick around and they're with us, especially the young kids, for the next 10 years, and they hear again and again and again the lives of the saints, the examples of the saints, they're going to be prepared to meet any kind of challenge, spiritually speaking. So that's a big part of it. I'm sorry I neglected it because I think it's huge in an Orthodox context. I don't know if I answered your question. You satisfied? Yes, good. Anybody else? Any other questions? Yes. You want to ask a question? Yes, yes. The whole question of community, right?
Creating community
And organization. Urbanization, yes. Well, I'm very happy that this school has 176 acres, and it's out somewhat in the country, not too far. And I think that we're in the same spot in Florence, Arizona. We're out in the country. We're far away from the urbanization. Urbanization in Greece, the question basically is, how do we deal with urbanization? How do we deal with the loss of community? And it is a huge reason why we have secularism in the church today. If you go back to the 1950s and 60s, that's when the exodus in Greece from the villages began. First they went to Thessaloniki and Athens, then they left for Australia and America, and slowly, and I'm sure the same thing happened in Serbia and everywhere, it's the same process. The villages emptied. What happened though to that villager, that simple, good, God-loving man or woman who left and now is in a city of 2 million or 1 million, and the churches are on 20 minutes down the road, and there's probably 150 or 200 people that he never sees except in church on Sunday, if he even gets to know that person. We're talking about a sea change in terms of community and in terms of the spiritual life. So in the village, they had a common center, and that was the church. And the church was the social center as much as the spiritual center. And they were there every Sunday. And in fact, in the village up in Greece, where I was for 10 years, the old-timers would tell me when they were kids, the school was right next to the church, and they were prepared by the teacher on Saturday, because they had Saturday school as well as Monday through Friday, and they were prepared one by one every Sunday for the boys to read the epistle in church. And then when they went in church, they all lined up in their church, in their school uniform, all together, very studiously. And it was a part of their life as students, as villagers. It was one organic, seamless garment, their life. Okay? Now take that, and now they've gone to the urban setting, and all of that is lost. And so they can become life becomes impersonal. And let's just put it in the very basic moral level. There's no one there to call them to accountability. Where were you on Sunday, friend? Why weren't you in church? They're not hearing the positive peer pressure that they had from the village setting. So this has had the number one effect. It's the number one problem, and it brought about secularism more than any other historical change in modern Greece, more than all the isms, ecumenism or secular or philotism or whatever other. That's, I think, what helps, gives birth to secularism, because you are no longer a part of the church is no longer incarnate. It's not, it loses that, the community is lost. And you don't see it take flesh, that we're all part of the body of Christ. So how do we solve it? Well, there is no easy solution, but what people are doing and trying to do, and in Arizona that's certainly what's happened, and it's not something that's been organized by one person, it's a movement of God's Holy Spirit, is that they're leaving the urbanized centers and the different parts of the United States, and they've come and they're living next to the monastery, and they're intentionally living in community. So there is no easy solution. You have to intentionally now create community if you want to have community. The problem is many times, and there's attempts that fail. Why? Why is there failure in this? Because it becomes what many people have called a hothouse. And it's not sober. It's not humble. It's not, there's a lot of immaturity and zeal not according to knowledge. And so it's a very delicate thing to create community. It has to be done, and it has to be done by people who are prepared to be patient. I mean, when you were in the village with 200, 500, 700 other people, you didn't choose who they were. You didn't choose your cousins and aunts and uncles and all the brothers and sisters. That's who you were, and you had no choice. That was your village. You lived there whether you liked it or not. But when you do an intentional community, if you don't really like the person down the street, you can get up and leave, and that's oftentimes what happens. And so you have to do what we're talking about, to create that community, which then enables us and supports us in the spiritual life and returns us to a normalcy in terms of communal life, because what we live on a daily basis is abnormal. It's not human. It's not human to live in small little apartments in large buildings and see no one most of the week, and to work 50 hours and all the stuff that goes into urbanization. It's not normal. It's not human. It's inhuman. And it's anti-evangelical, and it makes it hard to live the life of the gospel. So yes, intentional living, but with a lot of patience, humility, meekness, obedience. Otherwise, it's not going to be successful. You can come together, but you're not going to stick together. You're not going to be together because we're not prepared to do what it takes to stay together, right? It has to be intentional. It's like anybody who goes to a monastery will know to stay there is a crucifixion. It's a crucifixion. It's not how wonderful and easy. It's a crucifixion. And that's, of course, salvific. That's who we are. The cross is who we are. And that's salvation for us. But nonetheless, you have to be prepared to do what it takes to live in that. So the school is a wonderful development. If people can start to see that as the center around which the children will gather, around which the church will gather. I understand that the bishops' quarters hopefully will one day be built there, and he will be there as well, which is tremendous. You can see that as a potential center for the Serbian Orthodox and the larger Orthodox community. And let me say this, because I really wanted to say it earlier and I forgot. There's going to be a great danger, two extremes with the school that need to be avoided. One is this idea that we're going to make the school into our Serbian Orthodox enclave. We're going to make it into, and negatively speaking, that would be like a ghetto, right? We're going to go there and we're going to close the doors around us, and we're going to protect ourselves from anything that's going to threaten our Serbian Orthodox identity. That's going to be a major failure if that happens. That will not last. It is the same kind of hothouse of lack of sobriety and maturity and humility. It's not based on the gospel, it's based on our worldly identity as Serbians. It's not going to last, because if it's not divine human, if it's not inspired by the Spirit of God, if it's not the Christ at the center of it all, it doesn't bring fruits. So we've got to be careful. Yes, that's going to be the place where the traditions and the identity are going to be celebrated and are going to flourish, but not in a way that is just human. It's got to be divine human. It's got to be Christ at the center. And if Christ is at the center, even those who don't have the Serbian identity will embrace it and rejoice in it, and they will not be threatened by the Serbian / part of the Serbian Orthodox title in the school. I think it's a key thing going in. You have to consciously keep that in mind, because there's that temptation on the right, temptation which doesn't seem to be really a temptation, actually seems to be really good. Let's focus on that. No, it's going to be there if Christ is there. You don't need to focus on it. Just like people in Greece, they don't focus on being Greek, they just are. When you go to America and you meet Greek Americans, they got to put that Greek identity out there because they're threatened by the non-Greek community. But it's strange for a Greek person in Greece sometimes to encounter a Greek American. It's like, what's wrong with you? It's like there's like some kind of complex. We don't need that. Just be who you are, and that, if it's in Christ, it's glorious. It's glorious and it attracts people. Forgive me for taking the boldness to say that, but I wanted to say that because it's important for us to understand that dynamic. And we're not in Serbia, so it's not going to be the same kind of environment and experience that would be in Serbia. It's outside of that homogeneous society. And so you've got to deal with that pastorally and spiritually if it's going to be successful. It goes for the school as much as the larger community that will gather around it. What's that?
You said two extremes.
Well, the other extreme would be to secularize it and to bring it and make it into a place where we're going to water it down. One of the big temptations of schools, any school, is the following. We get to a critical mass, and economically we can't make it, right? We cannot keep it going because we don't have the funds or we don't have the means. And so the students start to dwindle, and inevitably the question is, should we open it up? In other words, should we make it acceptable to anyone and anything, and should we put water in our wine and to keep the thing going? And I've told people at the school in Arizona, it's better we close than we lose our Orthodox identity. But that's often the time. You see again and again, Harvard University started as a theological school for Protestants. Today, of course, it has nothing to do with Protestantism, even Protestant theology, in terms of being true to their roots, I mean. And there are untold examples of that in history of the United States, of religious communities starting as a very devoted to a particular identity, but over time that all is lost because they're interested more in keeping the doors open or success economically, and then they start to lose their identity. So that would be, I think, the other extreme, that we would go in the other extreme, and to keep the thing going, we start to change our identity to fit in and all the rest. Now, today, tomorrow, that's not really a threat, I think, but in 20 years, in 30 years, it may be. And again, that won't be avoided if Christ is not at the center. So it has to be the criteria have to be Christ-centered criteria. The people who are going to come there are going to come for Christ, whether they're Serbian or not. And it's going to be about the gospel. And then those two extremes are avoided. But if that's not there, then one of those two extremes we can fall into. Yes, sir. Yes, Father.
Regarding community,
Yes, of course, the parish is the community. I mean, so they're not going to lose their parish. They're going to go to church on Sunday. They're going to be a part of that. But it would be a larger pan-Serbian community where people from different parishes would meet. So I'm not trying to say this should supplant the parish community. I don't even think will there be services on Sunday morning at the school?
Absolutely.
Oh, there will be services. So there will be a parish. There will be a parish then.
It won't be a parish, it'll be a school. It'll be a school.
Okay.
A school chapel.
So you've got to work out how that's. Yeah.
I was thinking generally,
Yeah.
parish life should be organized as
Yes. Yes.
the most natural environment.
Yes. Yes.
The church actually.
Yes. Of course. Of course. Of course. So our
Powerful if we don't have parish. Right, with communities.
I'll tell you how. I don't know how. Everybody's going to deal with it pastorally different depending on what's happening. But I'll tell you how we're dealing with it. We have started a chapel. We have services during the week for the kids, but we also have it on the weekend. And the people in the community are gathering around, and it's becoming a parish. So it's got a double life. It's got a school reality for the kids, and then it has a weekend parish. So you've got to work pastorally how that's going to balance out. We don't have any other parishes around us except the monastery, so it's not an issue. But if there are parishes and people are leaving their parishes to attend there, then it's going to be something the bishop has to regulate. Any other questions? Any questions at all? I think, Father, yes.
What language do you use, Father, in your services?
So the majority of the people who attend our church on Sunday morning are either Greek background or Greek speaking. We have a large number of converts, and we have a large number of, percentage-wise, probably like a third are converts, and then we have a number of people who are from Russian backgrounds. We have a pan-Orthodox, very pan-Orthodox. So what I usually try to do is I'm working toward majority English, but I don't want to do chanting or services that are not beautiful, that are not appropriate for the Divine Liturgy. So if we can't chant it in English for whatever reason, because translation doesn't exist or the chanter can't do it, we do it in Greek. But I want to increase that. I want to be able to. One of the main goals I have is for this chanter who's coming over from Greece in a 2 weeks period. He's going to move with his family. He's going to be there. He speaks perfect English and perfect Greek, and he chants in English and Greek. One of our goals is to start a Byzantine chant school and to train all of our young people to chant in both languages well. But that's going to take time. But ultimately the goal is that we do everything well in English. That's the ultimate goal. Because that's the nature of the church, but it's also the nature of our community there. Most of the people there are converts to the faith, and their first language is English. But I don't feel any pressure from anyone to, the issue of language is very secondary in our community. We don't have this complex where we have to do one or the other. If it's done well, it's done with piety and reverence, people, whether they're Greek speakers or English speakers, they love it. The criteria is right. They want to pray. They want something prayerful. So it's important to go to English, but it has to be done well. That's my position. And it takes time to do that. Any other questions? Yes?
Father, you have mentioned that you would rather focus school than accept, not than start to accept anyone and everyone into the school.
Well, meaning that we would change our identity. You can accept non-Orthodox, but on the basis that they're going to accept, and we're not going to change our way of life, we're not going to change our identity. Yeah, we have a few non-Orthodox in our school. They're already catechumens. I mean, they almost immediately became catechumens. And I would accept somebody who's not Orthodox on the basis that they're very open to Orthodoxy and they're going to participate. If they're going to come in with their own agenda or anything, I'm not going to accept it into the school.
How do you deal with the issue with prayers?
Because they're catechumens, there's no issue. But if, let's say, they were not catechumens, I would allow them to be present. I probably would never have them pray, like say the prayers. But we don't do that anyway. We don't have that. It's very, very limited for the younger children. The prayer is short at this point. So there's not really an issue. But I think there would be a line drawn, and that would be for their benefit. the line drawn would be for their benefit, because if you start undiscerningly incorporating them into the life of the church without the presuppositions of them wanting to be Orthodox, you're actually undermining their desire and their good uneasiness and their feeling that they need to become Orthodox. In other words, you're taking away the feeling that they're missing something. So it would be very unproductive for us to treat everyone indiscriminately the same, even in the school setting. So I think there needs to be discernment and discretion. So if you have, let's say, I know one school in Florida, they have 60% non-Orthodox. And yet he says it's a Russian Orthodox church outside of Russia. He says he's doing everything. I don't know how he does it. I think it would be very hard to keep the boundaries in that setting, but I'd like to see how he does it. Maybe he has some particularly successful way of doing that and bringing. Many people have come and become Orthodox in his school. So I'm not dogmatic on it. It's a question of pastoral discernment, how you're going to deal with each case.
So, because it was sent, you were trying to say it was centered around liturgy and
Yes.
the whole, I wasn't even talking about the prayers.
Okay, well, divine liturgy, they leave. The catechumens leave. Yeah. And I'm very much in favor of that being reintroduced to the church. We're in a missionary setting. We're not in the old country. We're in a missionary setting. We have it in the divine liturgy. We should apply it. If we have catechumens, they should leave at the catechumens, and we can do it in a way that doesn't make them feel in any way separate from the rest of the community, but as a part of their pedagogical initiation into the life of the church. I've done that. My father has done that when he was a priest in Canada, and it's been very successful. People embrace it. When you explain to them what it means to be a catechumen and why they need to leave at the catechumenate, if they're interested and sincere and you're doing your job, they love it. They don't just accept it, they love it, because they understand that this is for a time. It's not, we're not rejecting you. This is what it means to be in preparation for baptism and all the rest. So it's a question of doing the work with the people. And so when we have the 3 kids that are catechumens, they leave. They leave the main church, they go into the exonarthics, and they're there with someone, and usually we keep them busy with something, pedagogically. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Question about education, about teacher, topic, and presentation of the class. And your statement was, I'm confused a little actually, with that statement that what we talk is not that much important. Is important teacher and the way he's teaching.
How? Yes. Yes.
I'm confused a little about
Okay, so obviously we're not going to teach anything we don't believe in. But in the order of things, in the hierarchy of what's going to remain with the child, he's not going to remember all of the lessons. He's going to remember the teacher and the love of the teacher. He's going to remember, and he's going to take, whether he likes it or not, from that teacher, the methodology, the ethos, the way that they lived, the way that they communicated, the way that they loved the child. That's what's going to remain with him. When you think back to your best teacher, you probably don't remember what they were saying, but you remember their face, their way, some particular moment that you had with them that really remained with you all your life. So that's what that means. Obviously, we're not going to become indifferent to what we're teaching. We're going to be very careful that we're teaching the appropriate material, but it's not as important as who we are as teachers and how we're teaching. That's what remains with the people throughout their life. Yes. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much for your attention and for coming.
What an amazing 13 days. 11 of which was spent educating and instructing our faith. I'd like to express my heartfelt appreciation for for the hard labor of love, invested his time and effort, invested among our people, among our community in Australia. Father Peter has helped us, I believe, to step out of a boxed way of thinking, or has helped us think outside of the narrative that we're used to thinking. And I think that's probably the greatest success of his talks. He's challenged our way of thinking because we are used to hearing many talks and many even theological presentations that follow a common narrative, something that is presented at our universities and then later on just reiterated, regurgitated to our people. So I'm very thankful to Father Peter for helping us really step outside of the box and to challenge ourselves as well and to crucify our reason, as you did mention many times in your talks. On behalf of my diocese, our clergy and faithful, I'd like to present you with a small gift as a token of our appreciation, not something to reward you with. Christ will reward you for your labor, but as a reminder to keep us in your prayers and to know that you are in our prayers as well. This is a pictorial cross that was designed by my predecessor, and it's the last one we have, actually. It embellishes a bit of this land. We've got our local gems here, the opal stones, and we also have this particular ornament, which is from the Nemanjić period, the Nemanjić dynasty. So it brings together both our Serbian and our Australian reality together, and I think that this will remind you of us, and hopefully it does, to keep us in your prayers and to come again when we call out, to hear our cry in the wilderness. Axios.